When a baby's cry echoes from Letitia Vane's fresh grave during Flaxborough's flower show, Inspector Purbright uncovers theatrical revenge, deadly secrets, and decades-old deceptions hidden beneath small-town respectability tonight. Good evening, mystery lovers. Before we dive deeper into this chilling tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? The Flaxborough Horticultural Society's autumn show had achieved that particular state of genteel competitiveness that marked the town's social calendar like a recurring fever. In the parish hall, trestle tables groaned beneath the weight of outsized vegetables and flowers that had been coaxed, bullied, and chemically encouraged into unnatural perfection. Mrs. Chubb, the society's secretary, moved between the displays with the measured tread of a general reviewing troops, her clipboard held like a weapon of bureaucratic precision. Inspector Purbright had not intended to attend. His presence was the result of what his landlady, Mrs. Teatime, had termed civic duty, though he suspected it had more to do with her determination that her prize chrysanthemums receive proper appreciation from someone in authority. He stood now beside a particularly aggressive display of bronze blooms, nodding with practiced diplomacy as Mrs. Teatime explained the superior qualities of her soil preparation. "The secret, Inspector," she confided, adjusting a flower head with the care of a museum curator, "is in the feeding. Not too much nitrogen, mind you. Mrs. Plummett's specimens always suffer from over-enthusiasm in that regard." Purbright murmured agreement while observing the hall's familiar social choreography. The Reverend Appleby hovered near the produce tables with the expression of a man hoping to avoid theological discussions about the spiritual significance of prize marrows. Councillor Spinks had positioned himself strategically near the judging table, ready to claim credit for any organizational successes. Mrs. Plummett herself stood guard over her own chrysanthemum display, radiating the sort of territorial vigilance that suggested she suspected sabotage. It was then that the crying began. At first, it seemed no more than background noise, the sort of infant distress that occasionally punctuated public gatherings. But as the minutes passed, the sound took on a quality that made people pause in their conversations and glance about with growing unease. It was thin, persistent, and seemed to come from no particular direction. "Someone ought to attend to that child," observed Miss Frail, the librarian, with the disapproval of someone whose professional life demanded quiet. But no child could be seen. The few families present had older children, and the babies in attendance were contentedly asleep in their prams. The crying continued, a wavering wail that seemed to drift through the hall like smoke. Mrs. Chubb, her organizational instincts finally overcoming her natural reluctance to interfere, began a systematic search. She peered behind display tables, checked the small kitchen, and even opened the cupboard where the folding chairs were stored. The crying grew neither louder nor softer, maintaining its eerie consistency. "It's coming from outside," announced young Timothy Brace, who had been pressed into service arranging chairs and possessed the acute hearing of the board. "From the churchyard, I reckon." The suggestion sent a collective shiver through the assembly. St. Cuthbert's churchyard lay immediately adjacent to the parish hall, its ancient stones and weathered monuments visible through the tall windows. The crying seemed to confirm Timothy's observation, drifting across the autumn air with unnatural persistence. Purbright found himself moving toward the door with that unhurried pace that had served him well in 20 years of police work. The crowd parted before him, their faces showing that mixture of relief and anticipation that marked any official intervention in moments of uncertainty. Outside, the afternoon light was fading into the soft grays of early evening. The churchyard stretched before them, its neat paths winding between monuments that ranged from elaborate Victorian angels to modest modern stones. The crying was clearer here, unmistakably the sound of an infant in distress, but still without visible source. "There," whispered Mrs. Teatime, pointing toward the newer section of the cemetery. "It's coming from over there." They moved as a group across the grass, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The crying led them to a fresh grave, its dark soil still showing the raw marks of recent interment. A simple headstone bore the inscription, Letitia Vane, 1923 to 1987, at peace. The sound was definitely coming from beneath their feet. "Oh, good Lord," breathed the Reverend Appleby, his face pale in the gathering dusk. "This is most irregular." Purbright knelt beside the grave, pressing his ear to the earth with the matter-of-fact manner of a man accustomed to unusual situations. The crying was clear now, unmistakably human, unmistakably distressed. He rose slowly, brushing soil from his knees. "Mr. Torkel," he called to the sexton, who had emerged from the church with the suspicious expression of a man whose domain had been invaded. "When was Miss Vane interred?" "Thursday last," Torkel replied, removing his cap with nervous respect. "Proper service, proper burial." Family was thin. Just a nephew from Lincoln came down. And the grave was properly sealed? Course it was. "I've been doing this work 30 years, Inspector. No shortcuts, no complaints." The crying rose again, thin and desperate in the evening air. Mrs. Plummet clutched her husband's arm, while Councillor Spinks adopted the expression of a man wondering how this would look in the local newspaper. Purbright studied the grave with the attention he might give to a crossword puzzle. Something was not quite right about the arrangement of funeral. Flowers. A wreath had been moved, and the soil showed signs of recent disturbance beyond what the burial itself would have caused. "I think," he said quietly, "we shall need to investigate this matter more thoroughly. Mr. Torkel, would you be so good as to fetch some tools? And perhaps someone might telephone Constable Chubb to join us." As the sexton hurried away, the crying continued its mournful chorus. The assembled townspeople stood in the gathering darkness, united by the peculiar horror of a sound that should not exist, coming from a place where silence was the only proper response. Purbright remained beside the grave, his pale eyes thoughtful in the fading light. In his experience, the impossible usually had very ordinary explanations. But as the baby's cries drifted across the ancient churchyard, he found himself wondering what sort of ordinary explanation could account for the dead learning to weep. The tools arrived with the sort of efficiency that marked genuine emergency in Flaxborough, where most crises were of the bureaucratic variety. Torkel returned at a measured trot, his thin frame supporting a hurricane lamp that cast dancing shadows across the weathered headstones. Behind him, Constable Chubb labored up the path on his bicycle, his lamp wavering as he dismounted with the careful dignity of a man conscious that his every movement was being observed by the town's assembled worthies. "Evening, Inspector," Chubb said, removing his helmet with practiced deference. "Bit of an unusual situation, I'm told." "Rather," Purbright replied, accepting a spade from Torkel with the same calm he might have shown when offered tea. The crying continued its relentless chorus, neither growing stronger nor weaker, maintaining that eerie consistency that had first unsettled the flower show attendees. As the investigation began, the crowd settled into that peculiar formation that marked any public spectacle in a small town. Mrs. Teatime appointed herself unofficial coordinator, ensuring proper viewing positions while maintaining respectful distance. Councillor Spinks had already begun calculating how this incident might reflect on municipal efficiency, while Mrs. Plummet clutched her husband's arm and declared it a sign, surely, of something unnatural. Purbright knelt beside the grave, his pale eyes studying the arrangement of funeral flowers, with the attention he might give to a crossword puzzle. Something was not quite right. A wreath had been moved, and the soil showed signs of recent disturbance beyond what the burial itself would have caused. "Mr. Torkel," he said quietly, "scrape gently by the headstone. 2 inches only." The sexton obeyed, his spade revealing more than compressed earth. A length of dull wire emerged, leading from beneath a particularly fussy wreath arrangement into the soil. The wreath itself sat crooked, its baby blue ribbon tied with mechanical precision. "Hold there," Purbright murmured, accepting Chubb's pocket knife to ease away more earth. A plastic corner appeared, grey, utilitarian, unmistakably modern. It came free with a sucking complaint, a lunchbox, sealed against damp with methodical care. When the lid was lifted, the crying escaped with renewed vigor. Inside, wrapped against moisture, lay a cheap cassette player of the sort sold in stationers beside novelty pens. The machine turned with dogged persistence, its battery indicator showing green. On the paper label, in deliberate capitals, someone had written simply, "Baby." Purbright clicked the stop button. The churchyard resumed its ancient quiet. "Well," said Councillor Spinks, discovering statesmanship in the moment, "a hoax. A very cruel hoax." "Cruelty is not requisite to hoaxery," murmured the Reverend Appleby, still pale but unable to resist a theological distinction, though it is frequently a side effect. But Purbright was examining a small card that had slipped half under the wreath's base. Thick paper embossed with ferns, no envelope. In the same careful capitals, "Hush, little one." The ribbon's knot showed the telltale asymmetry of left-handed tying, its tails barbered with scissors rather than torn. "Since Thursday?" he asked Torkel, almost casually. "Any visitors?" The sexton frowned, sifting memory with the care of a man whose observations might matter. The nephew, Friday afternoon, said he had to get back to Lincoln before traffic. A woman Saturday, dark coat, little hat, like an air hostess, left carnations. 2 old ladies, Sunday after service, thought it was the wrong grave, then decided it wasn't. And a lad late Sunday came on a motorbike with an exhaust like a pop gun. Didn't stay long. "You know him?" "Not to speak to." "A delivery boy, I reckon. One of those with skinny jeans and limited vocabulary." From the parish hall came the muffled rustle of people recommencing their interrupted evening. News, starved for several minutes, hurried back indoors to feed on speculation and embellishment. Young Timothy Brace was already rehearsing his crucial role in the discovery, adding dramatic flourishes about ghostly whales and trembling earth. Purbright rose and dusted his hands with characteristic deliberation. "Thank you, everyone. Mr. Torkel will restore the ground to proper order. Constable Chubb will take statements from those who were present when the crying began. Please do not improve your recollections as you walk back." The gentle admonition worked better than any sharp rebuke. They drifted away in small groups, voices already weaving the evening's events into the sort of story that would grow with each telling. As they walked back toward the hall, Purbright studied the card through its plastic evidence bag. The over-punctilious capitals suggested someone unused to handwriting, while a small smear showed where a full stop had been started, and then carefully erased. He found himself thinking of Letitia Vane, who had been at peace for precisely 4 days, and of the curious type of sentiment that chose baby blue ribbon for a funeral wreath. In his experience, elaborate deceptions usually served elaborate purposes, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that a dead woman's grave would weep like a child on the evening of the town's horticultural celebration. The question, as always, was why. The parish hall had resumed its customary quiet by morning, though the trestle tables still bore the ghostly impressions of prize vegetables and the lingering scent of chrysanthemum competitiveness. Constable Chubb had arrived early to collect the remaining witness statements, his notebook assuming the weighty importance of official documentation as he methodically recorded the recollections of Flaxborough's assembled worthies. Mrs. Teatime, having appointed herself chief witness by virtue of proximity to both inspector and prize flowers, provided the most detailed account. The crying began at precisely 6:20, she declared with the certainty of someone whose entire life operated by schedule. "I noticed because I was checking my watch. The judging was running late, and my chrysanthemums do not appreciate extended exposure to artificial lighting." Miss Frail, the librarian, offered her observation with characteristic precision. A thin complaint at first, rather like a kettle deciding it would not boil. I assumed it was the heating pipes in the vestry. They have made similar protests since the new boiler was installed. Purbright listened to each account with the patient attention of a man accustomed to extracting truth from the sediment of human observation. The timing interested him particularly. Whoever had placed the device had calculated the flower show schedule with considerable accuracy. In the station office, the evidence lay arranged on his desk with the sort of clinical precision that made mysteries temporarily manageable. The cassette player, cheap but functional, had been examined for fingerprints without success, wiped clean with the thoroughness of someone who understood such precautions. The recording itself proved to be a 3-minute loop of infant distress, neither particularly professional nor obviously amateur. "Interesting thing about that card, sir," Chubb observed, settling his considerable frame into the visitor's chair. "The paper stock is superior, embossed ferns, expensive manufacture, not the sort sold at Mrs. Hemming's shop." Purbright turned the evidence bag to catch the morning light. The fern pattern was indeed elaborate, suggesting a specialty stationer or perhaps memorial card supplier. The handwriting remained puzzling. Those careful capitals spoke of someone unaccustomed to writing by hand, yet the slight tremor in the lettering suggested either nervousness or advanced age. "The wreath ribbon," he mused. "Tied left-handed, you said." "The knot favored that direction, sir." "And the ribbon ends were trimmed with scissors held in the left hand. You can tell by the angle of the cut." Through the window, Flaxborough's morning ritual proceeded with reassuring predictability. Mrs. Plummet emerged from the baker's, while Councillor Spinks conducted what appeared to be an animated conversation with the postman, no doubt ensuring that news of the previous evening's excitement reached the widest possible circulation. The telephone's insistent summons interrupted his contemplation. Dr. Meadows's voice carried an unusual note of uncertainty that immediately claimed Purbright's attention. "Inspector, I've been thinking about yesterday evening's peculiar business. Most unsettling, really. But there's something about Letitia Vane's death that I should have mentioned earlier." "Oh? Well, it's probably nothing significant, but the timing was rather unexpected. She'd been rallying quite well in her final weeks. I'd anticipated she might last several more months. Then she simply slipped away Thursday morning, quite peacefully but rather suddenly." Purbright made a small encouraging noise that had served him well in 20 years of extracting reluctant information. "The thing is, Doctor," Meadows continued, "she'd been asking rather pointed questions about her medication in the days before she died. Wanted to know exactly what each pill was for, how they worked together. Most unlike her, she'd always been content to follow instructions without inquiry." "And you found this significant?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps I'm reading too much into coincidence. But a woman who dies unexpectedly after displaying unusual interest in her treatment, and whose grave subsequently produces mysterious infant cries. Well, it does make one wonder." After arranging to meet the doctor that afternoon, Purbright turned his attention to the telephone directory. Arthur Vane, Miss Letitia's nephew in Lincoln, proved to be a man of precise, almost pedantic habits when reached at his insurance office. "Aunt Letitia was a creature of routine, Inspector," he explained in tones that suggested disapproval of deviation. "Never married, no children certainly. The idea of babies in connection with her is quite preposterous. She had very definite views about proper behavior and appropriate sentiment. Her estate, modest but well organized. The cottage, small savings, furniture of good quality but unfashionable design. She left specific instructions for everything, including her funeral arrangements. No fuss, no elaborate displays. She would have been appalled by yesterday's theatrical nonsense." Vane confirmed his Friday visit to the grave. Brief, dutiful, unremarkable. He had noticed nothing unusual about the floral arrangements, though he admitted his attention had been focused on returning to Lincoln before the afternoon traffic. "One thing that might interest you," he added, almost as an afterthought. Aunt Letitia worked for many years at the telephone exchange, but before that she had a position at the old maternity hospital. Clerical. Work, I believe. She rarely spoke of it, but I gathered it had been rather an unhappy period in her life. Purbright replaced the receiver and sat quietly for a moment, considering the morning's accumulation of detail. A woman with connections to maternity care dies unexpectedly after questioning her medication. Her grave is made to cry like a baby. Someone goes to considerable trouble to ensure maximum public attention to this grotesque joke. In his experience, elaborate deceptions usually served elaborate purposes, and the more theatrical the crime, the more personal the motive was likely to be. "Constable," he said finally, "I think we shall need to learn considerably more about Miss Letitia Vane's years at the maternity hospital. People who inspire posthumous dramatics generally carry secrets that outlive their discretion." The morning was proving far more interesting than the previous evening's flower show had promised. By late morning, Purbright and Constable Chubb were making their way along the high street with the unhurried air of men whose business was official but not alarming. The high street approved of this approach. It preferred its policemen to proceed at the same measured pace as the post or the changing seasons. Mrs. Hemmings at the stationer's looked up from reorganizing her display of fountain pens with the expression of a woman about to be asked for something not kept in stock. She examined the fern-embossed card through its evidence bag with the professional interest of someone whose livelihood depended on knowing paper quality at a glance. "Not mine," she declared with the firmness of someone defending a reputation built on reliable stock. "The embossing is far too elaborate. We haven't carried that range since our wholesaler retired to Madeira and took his dyes with him. Everyone mourned the loss, briefly, then discovered they could manage quite well with daisies." Purbright studied the card with renewed interest. "You've seen similar work?" "Lincoln, Wickham and Pottle, the morning stationers. Their manageress has what you might call an enthusiasm for ferns. Couldn't get enough of the things. Cards, borders, even their envelopes used to shed little green fragments. A person of decided taste," she added, managing to suggest that taste, like enthusiasm, could be taken too far. Constable Chubb, who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local retail habits, leaned forward with interest. "Anyone asking recently for baby ribbon in that particular shade?" Mrs. Hemmings's expression sharpened with the satisfaction of someone whose memory had been properly consulted. "Yes, now you mention it. Saturday afternoon. A tidy woman, dark coat, neat hat, rather like those air hostesses used to wear when airlines maintained proper standards. Asked specifically for baby blue ribbon. Not too sweet were her exact words. She cut a sample herself to check the color. Left-handed, which I noticed because she attacked the scissors as if they had personally offended her." At Blake's, the florist, they found themselves navigating between white buckets of seasonal optimism, while Dolly Pratt, whose enthusiasm for flowers did not extend to their purchases, confirmed details that quietly sharpened Purbright's attention. "That wreath order was particular," she said, wiping soil from her hands with practiced efficiency. "Caller wanted a reinforced base with a shallow pocket at the back, like a little shelf for keeping mementos. Ordered by telephone Friday, collected Monday just after noon. Cash payment, no name given, which Mr. Blake considered rather rude but profitable. The person who collected it? A lad on a motorbike. Red helmet, exhaust that sounded like a mechanical complaint. Signed nothing, said nothing beyond TR. Had that smell about him, engine oil and institutional laundry powder." The afternoon brought Dr. Meadows to the station, carrying his worn leather bag and the slightly weary expression of a man whose morning rounds had included more than the usual share of imaginary ailments. He settled into the visitor's chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints had begun offering daily reminders of mortality. "I've been considering our conversation about Letitia," he began, accepting tea with grateful hands. Her questions about medication were quite specific in her final week. She wanted to understand interactions, what might happen if doses were altered or supplemented, most unlike her usual passive acceptance of medical advice. Purbright made a small encouraging sound that had served him well in extracting reluctant information. She mentioned having discussed these matters with someone who understood such things but wouldn't elaborate. I assumed she meant a relative, perhaps, though Arthur Vane seemed unlikely to possess medical knowledge. After Dr. Meadows departed, Purbright and Chubb made their way to Miss Vane's cottage, using the key provided by the Reverend Appleby with a small homily about the proper dignity due to the deceased. The cottage maintained its respectful quiet afternoon dust motes, performing their ancient dance in shafts of pale sunlight. The sitting room revealed the methodical habits of a woman who had lived alone and preferred order to spontaneity. On the telephone table, a lined pad bore a shopping list in careful handwriting. Milk, half. Stamps, Sister E at 3. Chloral only if thunder. On another page, written and then precisely crossed out with a ruler, Wickham and Pottle, ask for ferns. In the bedroom, pill bottles stood in neat formation like well-behaved soldiers. The chloral hydrate was half finished, but the digoxin bottle showed curious signs of having been decanted from older containers, faint shadows of previous labels visible beneath the current prescription from Bramley's chemist. But it was the bookshelf that yielded the most intriguing discovery. Among volumes of improving literature sat a cloth-bound collection, lullabies and soothing rhymes for the nursery. Inside the front cover, an inked stamp read, Flaxborough Maternity Home Library, 1951. No return date recorded. A dog-eared page revealed, Hush, little baby, with penciled annotations that altered the traditional promises into something considerably more stern. Tucked between the pages lay an old photograph in protective wax paper, a group of uniformed women and one civilian clerk with a severe fringe, unmistakably a younger Letitia Vane. The handwritten caption read, Staff, Michaelmas, 1949. Among the faces, Purbright recognized what would become Sister Edna, her eyes already showing that charitable severity that could reduce grown men to stammering apology. Curious thing, Chubb observed quietly, keeping nursery rhymes in a house that never knew children. People sometimes adopt the habits that life neglected to provide naturally, Purbright murmured, replacing the photograph with careful precision. Outside, Flaxborough's afternoon proceeded with reassuring predictability, but he found himself thinking about baby blue ribbon and the sort of secrets that outlive their keepers by exactly 4 days. The afternoon found Purbright and Constable Chubb making their way to St. Olave's home with the measured pace of men whose business was official but not urgent. The retirement home occupied a converted Victorian mansion that had discovered dignity in its declining years, its red brick facade maintaining the sort of respectful authority that suggested its residents had earned their quiet. Sister Edna received them in a small sitting room that bore the disciplined neatness of someone who had spent 40 years ensuring that hospital corners remained properly cornered. She poured tea with her left hand, the pot steady as a metronome, while her pale eyes assessed her visitors with the professional thoroughness of someone accustomed to detecting malingering at 20 paces. "You'll be asking about poor Letitia," she said, settling into a high-backed chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints had begun offering daily reminders of mortality. Most distressing business, that theatrical nonsense at her grave. She would have been appalled by such vulgarity. Purbright accepted his tea with the same calm attention he gave all potentially useful facts. "You knew Miss Vane well?" "We worked together at the old maternity home from 1947 until it closed in 1952. She was an exemplary clerk, Methodical, discreet, utterly reliable. The sort of person who remembered everything and repeated nothing, which made her invaluable in that particular environment. The emphasis in Sister Edna's voice suggested that the maternity home had required more than usual discretion. Purbright made the small, encouraging sound that had served him well in extracting reluctant information from those who possessed it. The home served young women whose circumstances required temporary accommodation away from their usual communities. Sister Edna continued, adjusting her cuffs with mechanical precision. We maintained the highest standards of care and confidentiality. Letitia understood the importance of absolute discretion in such matters. Through the window, Flaxborough's afternoon proceeded with reassuring predictability, but Purbright found himself considering the sort of secrets that might inspire posthumous dramatics. Young women in temporary accommodation, absolute discretion, the euphemisms painted a clear picture of the institution's actual function. Miss Vane's appointment with you last week, he said carefully, consulting his notebook. Your records show 3 o'clock, but her notes indicated past. Sister Edna's expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. She arrived at 3:30, certainly. I had expected her earlier, but Letitia had developed a tendency toward imprecision in her final months. Nothing serious, you understand, but she had begun to worry about details that had never troubled her before. What sort of details? Old cases, primarily. She had retained unofficial copies of certain records when the home closed. Against policy, but Letitia felt responsible for ensuring that placements remained satisfactory. Recently, she had become quite agitated about one particular case from 1949. Sister Edna rose and moved to the window, her starched uniform rustling with disapproval of past complications. A young woman had reappeared, asking questions about her child's placement. Letitia was quite distressed. She had always believed that closed chapters should remain properly closed. The woman was persistent? Extremely. She had married respectably, established herself in business, but remained unsettled about her decision. She had traced the adoption through considerable expense and determination. The adoptive parents had been told the mother was deceased, which was the usual arrangement in such cases. Purbright thanked Sister Edna and made his way back to the station where Constable Chubb was examining the chloral hydrate bottle from Miss Vane's cottage with the sort of methodical attention that had made him invaluable in 20 years of police work. Curious thing about this bottle, sir, Chubb observed, holding it up to the afternoon light. The current label is from Bramley's chemist, dated just a week before Miss Vane died. But there are shadows of previous labels underneath. Several of them. Most unusual for a prescription medication. Purbright accepted the bottle and turned it slowly, noting the faint impressions of earlier dispensing labels. Mr. Bramley is particular about fresh containers, I believe. Extremely particular, sir. He considers reused bottles unprofessional, yet this one shows clear signs of multiple use, as if someone had been transferring the contents from older prescriptions. The telephone summons interrupted their examination. Tommy Bracken, the delivery boy with the complaining exhaust, had been located at his mother's council flat, where he was attempting to restore mechanical dignity to his motorcycle with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested the problem was both chronic and expensive. "Cooperative lad," Chubb reported after the call. Says a woman approached him Saturday evening, offered £5 to collect a wreath Monday and deliver it to the churchyard. Specific instructions about placement and timing. She was well-dressed, spoke like someone accustomed to giving orders, and drove a dark saloon. Description: middle-aged, tidy appearance, small hat like those air hostesses used to wear. Left-handed, he noticed, because she counted out the money with unusual coordination, writing instructions with her right hand while handling currency with her left. Purbright leaned back in his chair, considering the accumulating evidence. Someone with resources and determination had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that Letitia Vane's grave would weep like a baby on the evening of the town's social gathering. The theatrical nature suggested deep personal grievance, while the timing indicated intimate knowledge of both the burial schedule and the community's routines. On his desk, the annotated lullaby book lay open to "Hush, Little Baby," its penciled marginalia revealing a mind that had found the traditional promises inadequate. Next to "Mama's Gonna Buy You a Mockingbird," someone had written, "Or a cage if you prove difficult." The handwriting showed the same careful, almost stiff quality as the capitals on the grave card. "Constable," he said finally, "I think we need to learn more about successful businesswomen who might have had reason to question Miss Vane's record-keeping practices. Someone who remembers giving up a child 30-odd years ago and has recently discovered that the arrangements made at the time were not quite as permanent as she had been led to believe." The afternoon light was fading into the soft grays of early evening, and somewhere in Flaxborough's respectable streets, a woman who drove a dark saloon was probably reflecting on the success of her theatrical gesture. The question, as always, was whether posthumous embarrassment had been sufficient revenge or merely the opening movement in a more elaborate composition. The morning journey to Lincoln proceeded with the sort of methodical efficiency that marked Purbright's approach to investigation, unhurried but purposeful, like a man following a promising scent through familiar territory. Wickham and Pottle occupied a narrow shop that exhaled the agreeable mixture of quality paper and commercial discretion, its windows displaying samples of their more elaborate work with the subdued pride of craftsmen who understood their market. The manageress proved to be a woman of precise habits who maintained her records with the thoroughness of someone whose reputation depended upon remembering details that others might consider insignificant. She produced the relevant receipt with the ceremony of presenting evidence, her manicured finger indicating the relevant entry. "Saturday afternoon, 4:30 precisely," she announced, consulting her ledger with satisfaction. "1 packet of Fern correspondence cards, heavy stock." The customer also purchased a small jar of gum arabic. Rather unusual, that. Most people prefer modern adhesives, but gum arabic provides superior hold when one requires something to remain absolutely secure. Purbright accepted this information with the same calm attention he gave all potentially useful facts. The gum arabic suggested someone who understood the practical requirements of concealing objects in outdoor locations where moisture and weather might compromise ordinary fastenings. The customer paid cash. Indeed, a woman of perhaps 50, well dressed in the manner of someone accustomed to quality goods. She wore a small hat, rather like those air hostesses affected when airlines maintained proper standards. Most particular about the paper quality, examined several samples before settling on the Fern pattern. Left-handed, which I noticed because she signed our satisfaction slip with that awkward precision that marks those who learned penmanship in an era that discouraged such tendencies. Back in Flaxborough, the morning's revelation about gum arabic led naturally to Mr. Bramley's pharmacy, where the chemist was arranging his window display with the sort of methodical precision that had made his establishment a model of pharmaceutical reliability for 30 years. He received their inquiry with the grave attention of someone whose professional conscience had been troubling him. "I should have mentioned this earlier," he began, his hands moving nervously among the bottles of patent remedies. "On the Tuesday before Miss Vane died, Sister Edna collected an additional supply of digitalis on the patient's behalf. The prescription appeared to be in order, duplicated from an older card that showed signs of considerable handling. I telephoned the surgery for confirmation, but Dr. Meadows was on calls, and his new receptionist assured me the continuation had been authorized." Purbright made an encouraging sound that had served him well in extracting reluctant admissions from those who possessed them. However, when I spoke with Dr. Meadows the following day, he seemed quite surprised. He had actually recommended a reduction in Miss Vane's digitalis, not an increase. Sister Edna's explanation about the doctor's advice was inaccurate. The implications of this revelation settled over the pharmacy like dust motes in afternoon sunlight. Someone with medical knowledge and professional authority had obtained medication that could, in sufficient quantity, accelerate a death that was already approaching through natural causes. Their next call took them to Carstairs Quality Provisions, a thriving catering business that occupied converted premises on the edge of the commercial district. Mrs. Pamela Carstairs received them in her office with the controlled efficiency of someone accustomed to managing both staff and circumstances to her advantage. She was handsome in the manner of women who had learned to command attention through competence rather than charm, her dark hair arranged with precision beneath a small hat that matched the witness descriptions with uncomfortable accuracy. "Inspector Purbright," she said, rising from behind a desk that bore the organized clutter of successful commerce. "I understand you've been making inquiries about poor Miss Vane." Most distressing business, that theatrical nonsense at her grave. She moved to adjust the window blind with her left hand, the gesture unconscious but telling. On her desk, Purbright noted a packet of correspondence cards bearing the distinctive fern pattern, though he made no comment about their presence. "You knew Miss Vane?" "We had historical connections dating back many years. She was helpful during a difficult period in my life, though recent circumstances had led me to question whether her assistance had been entirely in my best interests." Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to discuss painful subjects through the protective distance of formal language. Mrs. Carstairs settled into her chair with the sort of controlled grace that suggested considerable internal tension despite her composed exterior. "I established this business 15 years ago, Inspector. We specialize in reliable service for institutions that require both quality and discretion. It has been quite successful." "Including the old maternity home?" "Among other clients, yes, though that connection was established long after my personal dealings with the institution had concluded." She paused, adjusting her cuffs with mechanical precision. "I was 17 when I required their services, unmarried, and considered by all concerned parties to be in need of guidance regarding appropriate decisions." Purbright waited with the patience that had served him well in 20 years of extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. "The arrangements made at the time were described as final and beneficial to all parties. Miss Vane handled the administrative details with what I then considered exemplary discretion. However, recent developments had made me question whether the finality I was promised had been entirely accurate." "Recent developments?" My daughter, now 38 years old, had begun making inquiries about her origins. She discovered that her adoptive parents had been told I was deceased, which was not the arrangement I had understood at the time. When I approached Miss Vane for clarification, she became quite agitated, claiming that records were incomplete and that it was best to leave settled matters undisturbed. Mrs. Carstairs rose and moved to the window, her reflection showing the sort of controlled composure that suggested years of practice in managing difficult conversations. I had the distinct impression that she was protecting someone's interests, though not necessarily mine or my daughter's. After thanking Mrs. Carstairs for her cooperation, Purbright and Constable Chubb made their way back to the station through Flaxborough's afternoon bustle. The evidence was beginning to arrange itself into a pattern that suggested motives considerably more complex than simple revenge or theatrical gesture. 3 women, Chubb observed as they walked, each with connections to Miss Vane and the old maternity home. Sister Edna with the means to hasten death, Mrs. Carstairs with motive for revenge, and someone still unknown who arranged the crying baby as either memorial or warning. "Or," Purbright murmured, pausing to examine a shop window with apparent interest. "One woman with access to all the necessary elements. The question remains whether the grave's theatrical performance was intended to honor the dead or expose the living." In his experience, elaborate deceptions usually served elaborate purposes, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that Letitia Vane's final rest would be accompanied by the sound of infant distress. The timing suggested intimate knowledge of both the burial schedule and the community's social calendar, while the execution required resources, determination, and a thorough understanding of how secrets were kept in places like Flaxborough. As they reached the station, Purbright found himself considering the curious arithmetic of guilt and innocence in small towns, where the past was never quite as buried as people preferred to believe. The morning brought news of a second performance, delivered by Constable Chubb with the measured urgency of someone who had learned to expect the unexpected in Flaxborough's usually predictable routines. He had discovered it during his customary patrol of the churchyard, where the war memorial stood in its accustomed dignity among the weathered stones and careful plantings. "Another device, sir," Chubb reported, settling his considerable frame into the visitor's chair with the satisfaction of someone whose vigilance had been properly rewarded. Voice-activated this time, rather more sophisticated than the simple cassette arrangement. Triggered by any sound. Birdsong, footsteps, even the church clock striking the hour. Purbright accepted this information with the same calm attention he gave all potentially significant developments. The escalation from simple playback to responsive technology suggested someone whose theatrical ambitions were growing more elaborate with each performance. At the war memorial, they found evidence of considerable planning and symbolic intention. Arranged in a precise circle around the monument's base were 12 white roses, each bearing a small card inscribed with years from the maternity home's operation. 1947, 1949, 1950, and so forth through 1952. The flowers showed the clean cuts of professional preparation, their stems trimmed to identical lengths with the sort of obsessive precision that suggested profound emotional investment. The voice-activated recorder had been concealed within the memorial's stone base, wrapped in oiled cloth and secured with the same gum arabic that had marked the previous installation. When triggered by morning bird song or the footsteps of early churchgoers, it produced the same thin wail of infant distress that had marked the first incident, though this recording carried subtle variations. As if someone had assembled multiple examples of childhood complaint into a more complex composition. "The timing is quite deliberate," Purbright observed, examining the device with the attention he might give to a crossword puzzle. Whoever arranged this understood that the memorial receives regular morning visitors, veterans, flower arrangers, tourists consulting the war graves registry. Maximum exposure with minimum risk of immediate discovery. Mrs. Tea Time, who had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of the morning's excitement, provided her characteristic precise testimony. She had noticed the roses during her constitutional at 6:30, though she was certain they had not been present the previous evening. "Someone worked by torchlight," she declared with the certainty of someone whose observations had proven reliable in previous investigations. "The grass shows scuff marks, and there's a faint smell of paraffin from the torch fuel." Young Timothy Brace, whose status as discoverer of the first incident had elevated his importance considerably, offered additional observations with renewed enthusiasm. He had seen a dark saloon parked on Church Lane near midnight, its engine running quietly while someone moved about the churchyard with purposeful efficiency. "Professional work," he announced with the authority of someone whose mechanical interests extended to observing automotive behavior. "Engine tuned for quiet operation, not the sort of thing you'd use for casual mischief." But it was the discovery at Miss Vane's cottage that provided the morning's most significant revelation. Chubb had found the front door still locked, the windows intact, yet the interior showed signs of systematic search by someone who understood exactly what they sought. The methodical neatness of Miss Vane's living arrangements had been subtly disturbed. Cushions slightly askew, ornaments shifted from their customary positions, desk drawers left marginally ajar. "No forced entry," Chubb reported, consulting his notebook with professional thoroughness. Whoever it was possessed either a key or considerable skill with locks. The search focused specifically on Miss Vane's private papers, household ledgers, correspondence, the sort of informal records someone might use to supplement official documentation. The missing items proved most telling: a collection of bound notebooks that had occupied a specific shelf in Miss Vane's study, along with a manila folder labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence in her careful handwriting. These were precisely the sort of unofficial records that Sister Edna had mentioned, the documentation Miss Vane had retained when the maternity home closed, against policy but in accordance with her sense of responsibility for ensuring satisfactory placements. Someone acted on information from our theatrical friend, Purbright mused, examining the empty shelf space with characteristic attention to detail. The public display at Miss Vane's grave appears to have prompted urgent action by a party who preferred their historical arrangements to remain permanently private. Dr. Meadows arrived as they were cataloguing the evidence, his medical bag suggesting he had been summoned from morning rounds. He examined the cottage's disturbance with the professional interest of someone accustomed to reading the signs of human distress in various forms. "Curious timing," he observed, consulting the small notebook he produced from his waistcoat pocket. "I've been reviewing my predecessor's records since our previous conversation." Dr. Hartwell kept meticulous notes about the maternity home arrangements, and he specifically mentioned Miss Vane's tendency to maintain informal documentation of placements that extended beyond the official requirements. Back at the station, Purbright arranged the morning's evidence with the methodical precision that had served him well in 20 years of investigation. The voice-activated device represented a technical escalation that suggested either growing confidence or increasing desperation. The targeted search of Miss Vane's cottage indicated that the grave's theatrical display had achieved more than simple public embarrassment. It had prompted someone to act with considerable urgency to secure potentially damaging documentation. "Two separate actions," he observed to Chubb, "but clearly related. Our theatrical friend continues their public performances, while someone else works quietly to eliminate evidence of historical arrangements that were meant to remain permanently confidential. The question is whether we're dealing with collaboration or competition between parties with different but related interests." The morning light was strengthening, revealing Flaxborough in its customary state of respectable order, but Purbright found himself considering the sort of secrets that could inspire both public theatre and private crime. Someone understood that the past was never quite as buried as people preferred to believe, and they were taking considerable risks to ensure that certain arrangements from the maternity home's operation would receive either proper acknowledgement or permanent concealment. As the church clock struck 10, he realized that the investigation had entered a new phase. The theatrical gestures were continuing to escalate, while the stakes had clearly risen high enough to justify breaking and entering. In his experience, when people began taking such elaborate precautions to protect old secrets, those secrets usually proved worth protecting and worth exposing. "Constable," he said finally, "I think we shall need to learn considerably more about who else might have possessed keys to Miss Vane's cottage, and what sort of unofficial documentation might have been valuable enough to justify last night's professional attention. Someone is working very hard to ensure that certain historical arrangements remain undisturbed, which suggests they may be worth disturbing indeed." The afternoon found Purbright contemplating the peculiar arithmetic of keys and opportunities, while Constable Chubb pursued the unglamorous art of tracing Miss Vane's domestic arrangements. The cottage's violated privacy suggested someone who understood both the value of the missing documents and the precise location where such items might be stored. "3 spare keys," Chubb reported, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of methodical inquiry. "Mrs. Pring confirms she gave Miss Vane's key to Sister Edna the day after the funeral, assuming it would be returned to the vicar. The assumption proved optimistic. The Reverend Appleby, when consulted, produced his characteristic expression of scholarly bewilderment. His bureau had yielded a brass tag labeled "Vain, Spare," attached to nothing at all, while his memory of the key's return remained diplomatically vague. At Jennings Wireless and Repairs, where electronic mysteries were solved with patient persistence, Mr. Jennings confirmed the sale of a voice-activated recorder to a woman whose specifications had impressed him. Asked if the microphone would trigger to birds and church clocks, he explained, polishing his spectacles with professional pride. I told her it would trigger to angels if they breathed heavily enough. She smiled as if that weren't entirely a joke. The description matched their accumulating portrait: middle-aged, well-dressed, small hat, reminiscent of airline efficiency, left-handed but capable of writing with her right when circumstances required. Someone who understood both technical requirements and the importance of appearing unremarkable. Dolly Pratt at the florist provided confirmation of the morning's roses with her characteristic briskness. Shropshire snow, stem length specified to the half-inch. Telephone order last night, cash payment under the back gate by 9. The envelope showed those careful capitals, the kind made by people who don't write often but wish to be understood. Mrs. Carstairs received them in her office, with the controlled efficiency of someone whose success depended on managing both circumstances and appearances. She moved to adjust the window blind with her left hand while acknowledging their inquiry with professional courtesy. You'll have found that people remember things differently when they feel entitled to be mysterious, she observed, folding her hands with practiced composure. How may I be mysterious for you today, Inspector? Purbright noted the correspondence cards on her desk, fern-bordered, expensive stock, while maintaining the conversational tone that had served him well in extracting information from reluctant witnesses. Your business supplies memorial functions, he said mildly. Church halls, remembrance teas, occasions requiring both timing and discretion. Among other services, she replied. We have earned a reputation for reliability in sensitive circumstances. Someone arranged 12 white roses at the War Memorial with professional precision, he continued, allowing the observation to find its own level. If you're asking whether I took flowers to the War Memorial in the middle of the night, she said, I did not. My knees make protests at unannounced crouching. But any woman who has managed church socials knows how to move in darkness without being seen. Men never credit the infrastructure of their own public life. She did not invite examination of the fern-bordered cards. He did not stare at them, though their presence registered with quiet significance. He observed instead a small nick on her left forefinger, the sort of cut acquired from ribbon that punished clumsiness. Kitchen accident, she explained, following his glance with slightly excessive promptness. Mandolin slicer. It educates one's attention. That afternoon, a fern-bordered card arrived at the vicarage through the letter slot with prim decisiveness. In familiar capitals, it announced, Hush the years, not the children. The Reverend Appleby, whose theological generosity was matched by suspicion of anonymous literature, delivered it to the station like contraband. Purbright examined the card through its evidence bag, noting traces of gum arabic at one edge, evidence of previous attachment elsewhere before its current message. Someone who preferred their communications both permanent and relocatable. 2 separate impulses, he observed to Chubb as the church clock struck 4. One that enjoys making noise, another that prefers tidying. The question remains whether we're witnessing collaboration or competition between parties with different but related interests in Miss Vane's historical documentation. The afternoon light was fading, but Purbright found himself thinking that the investigation had reached a point where careful observation might soon yield to more direct inquiry. Someone was working very hard to ensure that certain arrangements remained either properly exposed or permanently buried. The evening found Purbright arranging the day's evidence with the methodical precision of a man whose 20 years of investigation had taught him that truth usually emerged from the patient accumulation of small certainties rather than dramatic revelations. The fern-bordered cards lay in their protective bags like pressed flowers from a particularly thorny garden, their careful capitals speaking of someone who wrote infrequently but wished to be understood with absolute clarity. Constable Chubb returned from his rounds bearing the sort of supplementary information that transformed speculation into something approaching certainty. "Dr. Meadows sends his compliments," he reported, settling his considerable frame into the visitor's chair. "Says he's been reviewing his notes about Miss Vane's final week, and there were aspects he should have mentioned earlier." The doctor's belated revelations, delivered through Chubb's methodical recitation, painted a picture of a woman whose customary passive acceptance of medical guidance had given way to surprisingly specific inquiries about drug interactions. Miss Vane had telephoned the surgery 3 times, asking detailed questions about digitalist combinations that suggested considerable pharmaceutical knowledge, not the sort of information one acquired from casual reading of patent medicine advertisements. She mentioned consulting with someone who understood these matters professionally. Chubb continued, consulting his notebook with characteristic thoroughness. When pressed, she said recent conversations had made her reconsider certain past decisions, and that she felt obligated to make proper arrangements before her condition deteriorated further. Purbright accepted this information with the same calm attention he gave all potentially significant developments. The timing was particularly telling. Miss Vane's sudden interest in cardiac acceleration had coincided precisely with her growing agitation about the maternity home records and the renewed inquiries from women seeking information about children placed decades earlier. Through the window, Flaxborough's evening proceeded with its customary respectability, but Purbright found himself considering the curious relationship between professional knowledge and personal desperation. Someone with medical training had clearly provided Miss Vane with information that enabled her to calculate the precise timing of her own death, ensuring that uncomfortable revelations would be permanently silenced before they could disrupt arrangements that had proved profitable for decades. Yet someone else had responded to that death with theatrical gestures designed to ensure maximum public attention to secrets that others preferred to remain buried. The crying baby, the roses, the pointed messages about hushing years rather than children, all suggested someone who understood the symbolic weight of infant distress in connection with Miss Vane's professional history. "2 separate impulses," he observed to Chubb, "though I begin to suspect they may spring from the same source. One that prefers dramatic exposure, another that requires careful concealment. The question is whether we're witnessing internal conflict or strategic complexity." Mrs. Carstairs possessed both the means and the motive for the theatrical displays, while her catering business suggested the organizational skills necessary for such elaborate timing. But the same determination that drove her to public gestures might equally compel her to secure potentially damaging documentation before others could examine it too closely. The missing records from Miss Vane's cottage represented more than simple burglary. They suggested someone who understood precisely which documents might contain information worth protecting or exposing. Someone who knew that the maternity home's unofficial operations had continued well beyond its official closure, and that certain arrangements presented as final and irreversible had been nothing of the sort. "I think," Purbright said finally, rising from his desk with characteristic deliberation, "it's time we tested our accumulating theories against more direct observation. Mrs. Carstairs has been most cooperative in our inquiries, but cooperation sometimes conceals as much as it reveals." He moved to the telephone with the unhurried pace of a man whose plans had achieved proper clarity. "Mrs. Carstairs, Inspector Purbright. I wonder if you might spare a few moments this evening for a brief discussion about Miss Vane's personal effects. There are documents that might be of particular interest to you. Shall we say 8 o'clock at the station?" Her agreement came with a sort of controlled promptness that suggested she had been expecting such a call. As he replaced the receiver, Purbright reflected that the most revealing conversations often occurred when people believed they understood exactly what questions would be asked. The evening air carried the scent of autumn flowers and the distant sound of the church clock marking another hour in Flaxborough's usually predictable routine. But he found himself thinking that some secrets, once disturbed by crying babies and midnight roses, required more than theatrical gestures to restore them to proper rest. Mrs. Carstairs arrived at the station with the punctuality that marked her business success, though her usual composed efficiency showed subtle signs of strain beneath its carefully maintained surface. She settled into the visitor's chair with the sort of controlled grace that suggested considerable internal tension despite her professional demeanor, accepting tea with a polite nod while her pale eyes assessed the room's contents with practiced discretion. Purbright had arranged the interview room with his characteristic attention to suggestive detail. On the desk lay a small collection of items that might or might not prove significant. A spool of baby blue ribbon, the gum Arabic jar with its torn paper seal, a pair of inexpensive scissors, and a manila folder labeled in his neat handwriting, "Maternity Home, Miscellaneous Records." The evidence spoke without proclamation, inviting observation rather than demanding attention. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Carstairs," he began, offering her a fountain pen that had defeated many hasty hands. "If you'd note your presence in our visitor's book." "Just name and time, nothing elaborate." She wrote with her right hand, legibly, but with the careful labor of someone taught to suppress natural inclinations. When he asked, almost as an afterthought, if she might address an envelope to the Reverend Appleby, "It saves my clerk the bother," she printed in those tidy, over-punctilious capitals that Flaxborough was learning to recognize. "The clasp on this folder proved stubborn," Purbright observed mildly, indicating the manila file. "Perhaps you'd trim a length of ribbon to secure it properly." He set the scissors down without emphasis. She took them in her left hand with unconscious efficiency, wincing fractionally as the blade grazed the healing nick on her forefinger. "Kitchen discipline," she explained, schooling the injured hand behind her teacup. "Mandolin slicers punish inattentive vegetables." A soft knock preceded Sister Edna, who entered with the formal surprise of someone invited to the wrong drawing room but determined to make the best of it. "Inspector," she acknowledged with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Carstairs." The second greeting carried the cordial coolness of tea poured from a pot one did not entirely trust. "I hope you'll forgive my economy," Purbright murmured. 2 conversations, 1 warm room. These autumn evenings encourage efficiency. He allowed small talk to establish itself, while cups were adjusted and positions settled. Then, as if recollecting a minor administrative detail, he asked, "Sister, the spare key to Miss Vane's cottage." "The vicarage records show it has not yet been returned." Sister Edna set her saucer down with mechanical precision. "Temporarily mislaid, I'm afraid. I intended to check on certain devotional bequests. There was no impropriety in the arrangement. And the additional digitalis collected on Tuesday." "A kindness performed under administrative pressure," she replied with the careful phrasing of someone who had prepared for such inquiries. "The surgery staff provided conflicting guidance. I erred toward continuity of care." Mrs. Carstairs, who had been studying the gum Arabic jar with quiet intensity, observed, "Continuity sometimes resembles habit in its least flattering attire." Purbright opened the manila folder with no more ceremony than if revealing bus timetables. Inside lay photocopied pages bearing Miss Vane's meticulous handwriting, dates arranged in careful columns, initials that might once have provided adequate anonymity, and penciled marginalia that suggested decades of careful record-keeping. One notation, circled in red ink, read simply, "PC, arrangements reconsidered, discretion essential." "Recovered from Miss Vane's private effects," he explained conversationally. Her administrative thoroughness extended well beyond official requirements. Rather touching, really, the care she took to ensure proper documentation of informal arrangements. Sister Edna's gaze remained steady, though the muscle at her jaw demonstrated a definite opinion. Mrs. Carstairs' attention moved from the ribbon to the penciled notation with the wary recognition one gives familiar music played in an unexpected key. The telephone's well-bred interruption provided natural punctuation. Purbright answered, listened with professional courtesy, and thanked Mr. Jennings for confirming the recent purchase of voice activation equipment by Our Lady with airline standards of presentation. If these notebooks were to be lodged with the diocesan archive, he suggested upon returning, sealed but properly catalogued, would either of you object? It would spare us the vulgarities of public speculation while ensuring historical accuracy. Sister Edna's cup clicked against its saucer with mechanical disapproval. Private griefs do not become public curiosities merely by aging, Inspector. Mrs. Carstairs chose her words with visible care. Clarity has considerable value, but so does appropriate containment. The living must bear responsibility for the dead's administrative complexities. Quite so, Purbright agreed, replacing the documents with deliberate neatness. In that spirit, I shall convene a brief meeting tomorrow afternoon in St. Cuthbert's vestry. Nothing theatrical, merely an opportunity to ensure that historical arrangements receive proper contemporary understanding. After they had departed, leaving cup rings like measured footprints on his desk, Purbright stood quietly by the window. Flaxborough pursued its nocturnal proprieties with customary discretion, though somewhere a car engine idled with the thoughtful patience of someone reluctant to announce departures. He returned to examine the gum arabic jar, noting the faint floral scent on its rim. Something businesslike, yet distinctly feminine, professionally applied, but personally significant. Tomorrow's vestry meeting would provide the proper setting for final clarifications, where the accumulated weight of evidence could achieve its natural resolution without theatrical gesture or administrative evasion. The vestry of St. Cuthbert's maintained its ancient dignity despite the afternoon's unusual assembly, its stone walls having witnessed centuries of human complexity without losing their capacity for discretion. Purbright had chosen the setting with characteristic deliberation, neutral ground where truth might emerge through conversation rather than confrontation, beneath the watchful gaze of ecclesiastical propriety. Mrs. Carstairs arrived with punctual efficiency, though her usual composed demeanor showed subtle signs of strain beneath its carefully maintained surface. Sister Edna followed with measured steps, her starched uniform rustling with the sort of disapproval reserved for circumstances that required such gatherings. Dr. Meadows completed the assembly, his medical bag suggesting recent summoning from afternoon rounds. "Thank you all for coming," Purbright began, settling into his chair with unhurried manner. On the oak table before him lay the accumulated evidence, voice recorders, fern-bordered cards, the recovered notebooks that had been mislaid from Miss Vane's cottage, each item speaking without proclamation. "Mrs. Carstairs," he said mildly, "your business success demonstrates understanding that some occasions require both timing and discretion. The crying baby at Miss Vane's grave was timed to coincide with our flower show, ensuring maximum public attention to secrets that others preferred buried." She accepted this observation with controlled grace. 38 years ago, I was assured that certain decisions were final and beneficial to all parties. Recent developments suggested that finality had been considerably more flexible than I was led to believe. Purbright consulted the recovered notebooks with characteristic attention to detail. Miss Vane's records indicate that children thought permanently placed were subsequently relocated when more prosperous adoptive families became available. Families told their children's mothers were deceased discovered years later that the mothers had been paying ongoing fees for what they believed were permanent arrangements. Sister Edna's expression remained steady, though her hands moved with mechanical precision. The home maintained the highest standards of care and confidentiality. Arrangements were made according to professional judgment, including arrangements that continued well beyond the home's official closure, Purbright observed. When Mrs. Dark Carstairs learned her daughter had been told she was dead, while she had been paying quarterly fees for 20 years, she felt entitled to clarity. Mrs. Carstairs' composure showed signs of strain. The crying baby was intended to suggest that Miss Vane's grave held secrets worth exposing. If the dead could not speak, perhaps they could weep. While someone else wished the town to hear nothing at all, Purbright continued, turning to Sister Edna. Miss Vane died more promptly than Dr. Meadows expected. The additional digitalis you collected against medical advice, combined with your possession of her cottage key, enabled both acceleration of death and removal of potentially embarrassing documentation. Sister Edna rose with measured dignity. Miss Vane requested assistance in calculating proper dosages for someone who wished to avoid prolonged suffering. Her conscience had become burdensome regarding old arrangements. Dr. Meadows leaned forward with clinical disapproval. Assisted suicide dressed as medical compassion. Most irregular, though I suspect Miss Vane's condition would have proved fatal within weeks regardless. The afternoon light filtered through ancient windows, casting patterns that had witnessed centuries of human complexity. Purbright reflected that some secrets, once exposed to proper scrutiny, proved less dramatic than their concealment had suggested. Mrs. Carstairs, your theatrical gestures achieved their intended effect. The arrangements have been exposed. Sister Edna, your assistance to Miss Vane, while irregular, appears motivated by misguided compassion rather than malice. Both actions spring from understandable human impulses, though the methods chosen were regrettably complex. He gathered the evidence with methodical precision. The matter will be referred to appropriate authorities, though I suspect the passage of time and complexity of circumstances will suggest that justice is best served by ensuring such arrangements cannot be repeated rather than pursuing prosecutions that would serve no constructive purpose. As the assembly dispersed into Flaxborough's afternoon routine, Purbright reflected that the investigation had revealed truths both more and less dramatic than the crying baby had suggested. The churchyard resumed its ancient quiet, though the memory of infant cries would linger like an echo, refusing proper burial. By evening, Councillor Spinks was already translating the drama into administrative triumph, while Mrs. Teatime prepared her chrysanthemums for winter rest. Life in Flaxborough would resume its predictable rhythm, its surface unruffled, though beneath the quiet currents of human consequence would continue their ceaseless flow. The end.